Good evening, everybody. مساء الخير. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all. I'm going to say a few things about the event and about the invitation and about the news center before we get to the real important business of today's gathering. It's almost 3 years since we actually last held a public event. That's 3 years of our lives that have passed without us having any contribution to public life in Doha. Prior to that, as most of you recall, we were very active within our community, not only with internal workshops and publications and daily news, but we had a role to play in the larger community. We had a monthly event on average where we convened discussions about important subjects in the region, in the world, but also including in Doha. We're now back officially, and we're back with a new brand. We're now the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, reflecting the change, one aspect of the change and many changes that have happened in the world over the last few years. We're extremely happy to reconnect with you again, to reassert our presence in Doha, and to welcome you all. I'm looking around and I'm seeing a lot of friends and colleagues and people who've been with us for many years, and many of whom I have not actually seen in several years. So I'm especially happy at the personal level and grateful to you for being with us today. If not for the upcoming World Cup, we will probably be organizing another event in the month of November, and we will continue with that cycle. But we have some important business around the World Cup that we all will be attending to and influenced by. So we will probably be back in a few months with a more regular cycle of activities and engagements for which you're all welcome. We thought we would start tonight's event, or we would start our event season, our comeback event, with an important theme, a theme that many of us are thinking about, mostly struggling with, and trying to make sense of at the moment. And the theme is the so-called regional order that is emerging, that is developing, that is evolving, that we are very much a part of in Doha over the last year or two, and I'll say a little bit more about that, and our speakers will come in and help illustrate the discussion that we're trying to get underway. Many of you recall in January of 2021, the Al-Ula Summit that was held in Saudi Arabia, where all the Gulf countries convened at the highest level and announced the end of the Gulf crisis. That was an important event for the region that signaled the beginning of what we have seen over the last 2 years across the region. A lot of de-escalation, a lot of steps being taken by countries to re-normalize, to re-engage. I can point to many examples out there, but I'm sure many of you have observed them. Bilateral visits at every level. There is a truce in Yemen that has held up for a long time, and a ceasefire that has held up in Libya for close to a year and a half. We've seen accords being signed by some of the regional neighbors and the State of Israel, and we've seen a host of other initiatives that give the impression that the region's problems are behind it. The JCPOA discussions have been underway now for months. And while the progress has not been finalized, the fact that there is movement over the last year in this direction is part of this new normal that we are observing in the region. The problem that many of us have struggled with is this new normal is taking place without any of the underlying conflicts in the region being resolved. There is no resolution in Yemen. There is no resolution in Libya. The Eastern Mediterranean remains a hot spot. The Gulf could become another flashpoint. And there is every reason to worry that with all the uncertainty and the dislocation, we could see a re-escalation if we miss the opportunities to build a new, sustainable, and a stable regional order. This was the plan of our event a few months ago. But we were overwhelmed, as most of you have, by the changing international environment. There is a war in Ukraine. There is an intensifying confrontation between the US and China. The international system appears to be in a state of turmoil, volatility, and with it, a lot of uncertainty. How does that affect what's happening in the region? How do regional players, regional actors, small countries, big countries, from North Africa all the way to the Gulf, respond and react? What does this mean for the future of stability? What does this mean for the future of a more normal, stable region that thrives economically, that is politically reconciled, and that addresses the core issues that drive day-to-day concerns of ordinary people? These are some of the questions that we've been struggling with. I'm sure I'm echoing a lot of your own thoughts and your own concerns. And we thought we would bring together a panel of distinguished speakers to help us think through this. We have assembled quite the distinguished panel representing multiple views from the region, from the outside of the region, global powers, regional powers, aspiring powers. And we will engage them tonight in a discussion that will initially start with their set of remarks, followed by a Q&A session where, inshallah, all of you will participate, help to shed light, pose questions, or challenge some of what you heard. I'm not going to go through the introductions of each of these speakers. I'm sure you know all of them. Many of them are familiar faces from TV. Others are people who have served in public life as diplomats, as analysts, and as advisors. To start with, I'm going to go to my dear friend Joe Bahout, the director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy in Beirut at the American University of Beirut, who will hopefully provide an initial set of remarks on the view from within the region, on what's happening in the region and how the external environment affects everything. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Tariq, and thank you very much all for being here. Thank you for the invitation to Qatar. It's always a pleasure, a big pleasure to be in Doha, and congrats for the launch of your new center. I wish it a successful and long life. In fact, I'll echo you very much and maybe follow up walking in your footsteps, but the presentation that you made. What I want to say very briefly is that everything indicates, when you look at the international order, the world system, and the regional order, that we are, in fact, heading probably towards a lot of volatility and instability. But however, these are, let's say, capped. They have a sort of ceiling that will probably prevent the region in going into a full-fledged confrontation, but not excluding certain skirmishes, let's say clashes, localized and sometimes low-level warfare. Why? First of all, on the macro picture, and you said it, the international system is today in a very high level of flux and fluctuation. You know, I mean, of course, we've been living with the question of what remains of the American might internationally for the last maybe decade. It has started after probably the war in Iraq, and then it went through the Obama administration. Donald Trump gave it a new tone or undertone, and today the question is still there. what kind of US, what kind of America for the 21st century. You said it, Cold War or at least confrontation or rivalry looming with China. And a country like Russia that is in fact probably not able to fill the vacuum, but that is also behaving in a very aggressive way, and this is where we have today the war in Ukraine. So we have, let's say, a world order that is not anymore, of course, unipolar as it was. It's not yet multipolar. It's somewhere in between, and we can maybe call it an apolar world, meaning a world without real poles, which is by definition and by itself something very destabilizing. Added to that, on the regional level, we have the rise since 10, 15 years of regional superpowers that sometimes, some of them, could on a case-by-case or depending on the issues, also behave as if they have a global pretension. Countries like sometimes Turkey on certain issues, countries like the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia maybe, Israel, of course, Turkey, I mentioned Turkey. So also the rise of new powers that have increasingly the ability to get free or to free themselves from the diktat or let's say the injunctions of the big powers that used to be their patrons before. They are able to say no, they are able to set their own agenda, they are able to take things into their hands, and sometimes they are acting in a way that we can call disruptive. They are very disruptive, sometimes they are revisionist, they contest the world order, they contest the established order, just because also they have, let's say, appetites that are still unsatisfied. However, and this is where probably we come to what maybe prevent a full-fledged conflagration, these powers, these regional powers, and this is, I think, a very important feature to note, they tend to strike deals in a very transactional manner with sometimes their rivals and not only their friends. I mean, you made a very interesting list, but all these deals, all these, in Arabic we could call them tafahumat or taswiyat, are not in fact complete peace agreement or normalization agreements. They are temporary lulls, but the temporary can go very long, very far. Just to give you a very recent example, yesterday evening, for example, this deal, this maritime border deal between Israel and Hezbollah, not even Lebanon in a way or another, that is in fact not completely ending the state of warfare between the two entities, but probably establishing a very long truce along the border in the south. This is exactly one phenomenon. Turkey, for example, normalizing with certain Gulf states, with Egypt, without ending completely the list of recriminations that was at the start or at the root of the conflict. So you have a set of transactional agreements that, in fact, are also freeing, in a way or another, increasingly, these regional powers from, let's say, the constraint or the weight of the international system. To end on that, on the domestic levels or on the micro-regional level, and this is why also I think we are to expect a bit of instability ahead. And here we're talking in Doha, we're in the midst of the Arab world. I'm coming from an Arab country. We tend to forget that the decade that is behind us, that was opened in 2010 or 2011 with the Arab revolutions, has not completely closed yet. I mean, Syria is still a country that is at war in a way or another. Iraq is unstable. Tunisia is maybe on the verge of a counter-revolution. The story, let's say the sequence of the Arab revolutions and what caused them has not been addressed. I mean, the root causes are still here. They are underneath the surface. There has been a security treatment, a counter-revolution, let's say a restoration order that has prevailed. However, the problems are still there, and they will probably resurface again. So To start with the domestic level, you have things that are still here causing potential instability. On the regional level, you have a relative, let's say, web of agreements that are not completely peaceful, or they don't produce a peaceful dynamics. And on the international level, you have a system that is today probably more unstable than ever. Maybe you can find an example in the 19th century, but this is really very far in time. So for all these reasons, I think that we have to expect, if not a total reset, but at least a long-term instability and soul-searching in the region.
Thank you, Joe. Ambassador Haslak will come to you right now for helping us think through the view in DC on those issues. I don't think I'm revealing a secret here when I say that it has become now common for people to assert openly that the U.S. is withdrawing from the region. The U.S. is not only pulling back, but it's this very precise pullback that is forcing countries to find ways of making the kind of deals that Joe has alluded to. It's this absence of a security guarantor and uncertainty about the U.S. commitment that is creating this reset, so to speak. On the other hand, the U.S. is now engaged in an intensifying geopolitical competition with China and is confronting Russia and Ukraine. Help us think through this view from Washington.
Well, that's a pretty tall order. I should point out that I retired from the U.S. State Department at the end of 2017. So I've been not living in the United States for a bit of time. Although I have, like the rest of you, I do follow very closely what's been happening. I should also point out that unlike my colleagues here, I am not an academic, which gave me a lot of freedom to read a lot of different pieces that academics have written on these potential subjects. So I hope you don't mind if I pulled some of their ideas, and I'd be happy if anybody's interested in some of them to provide where I got some of the sources for my information. And finally, I'd like to say, I'm not an expert on the Middle East, although I have lived in the region and worked in the region briefly. But I do think that having served in other parts of the world, I can bring some perspectives, and some of them may be useful to the situation, the tall order that you've just given me. So anyway, let me start with, I'm going to probably focus more on the larger global aspects of what's going on now, since I am not an expert on what's happening in each of the individual countries. We are looking at a new world order in the making. This could benefit the Middle East if handled by the countries in the region in the right way. I'm going to start with the great power competition as it stands now, how it's evolving, because I think it's important to remember that great power dynamics evolve. And I'd like to end with some suggestions on how the region could respond. And I think, Joe, you hit on some of the areas where the Middle East is negotiating and having talks with each other about some of the problems in the area. I said we're witnessing a major challenge to the world order, unlike anything we've seen since the fall of the former Soviet Union. The international rules-based order, US-led for the most part, is being challenged by both Russia and China, each intent on overturning the order and following a more authoritarian path. It's not as simple as great power competition or the new Cold War, as many are calling it, with countries sorted neatly into democracies that embrace the status quo and autocracies that seek to reverse or otherwise overthrow the existing order. It's much more complicated, with allies and adversaries competing and working together on a series of issues. There are many more players that can have a positive or negative impact on the outcome. A multipolar approach is better suited to the realities of today. Neither the United States, and I believe China as well, wants to manage the Middle East. Nor is either country abandoning the Middle East. America is committed to security with Israel and can't ignore Iran, but it does not wish to be the dominant. This requires a recognition in the Middle East that the United States is more focused on regions where it has significant interests, and a realization that regional powers also have an interest in securing their neighborhood in stabilizing or a destabilizing way. I'm going to give you some examples, not saying whether one's destabilizing or stabilizing, but Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Iran and Iraq, Israel and Lebanon, Egypt and Sudan, and Turkey and Syria. Those are just a few, where each of those countries has an interest and it has an impact in this neighborhood. But no one country is watching over the Middle East or managing it to reduce the risk of conflict. To the extent there was a Trump doctrine, is that the region should look after its own interests and not expect the United States to do so. I think one of the speakers yesterday, Tarek, Richard Utsin, said yesterday that this is actually a view held by both parties in the United States since 2012, which won't change fundamentally even with the war in the Ukraine. Everyone in this room can list why this doesn't happen and identify the fundamental blockages. Sometimes it's easier to blame the international order. Let me turn to the United States for a moment, since I guess you'd be disappointed if I didn't talk about the United States a little bit. I said the United States is not interested in detailed management of the Middle East, although it is interested in maintaining good relations. Why? Every effort the United States has made to forge a regional collective security system in the Middle East, and I'm going to go all the way back to the Baghdad Pact, similar to those built in Europe and Asia after World War II, has failed. In the Middle East, the United States has tried to contend with a complicated set of circumstances, including greater internal instability, competition, various regional actors' aggressive behavior, to include terrorism and nuclear weapons, and the historic inability of Arab states to align with Israel given the latter's conflict with Palestine. The U.S. commitment to the region had some successes, probably people could argue up to September 9/11. But after that, when the United States launched major military diplomatic efforts to eliminate regional conflicts, that largely failed. This continued up to the current administration with its 2021 interim national security policy, placing an explicit priority on countering China and secondarily Russia, with its little attention on the Middle East. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine has altered that course, not only by changing the security landscape in Europe, I'm thinking of NATO expansion in this case, but also in recognizing that the Middle East and the key states in it are important in the longer-term competition with Russia and China and some of the neighbors in the region. The U.S. is no longer pivoting away from the Middle East, but is also counting on the Middle East to do more within the region itself. Sorry, it's a little prepared, not as good as off the cuff, these academic guys. So the U.S. still, and I agree with you, Tarek, the U.S. still has a lot to do to convince the Middle East about America's staying power. In President Biden's meeting with the Gulf Cooperation Council +3, 9 leaders in all, he said, "We will not walk away and leave a vacuum to be filled by China, Russia, or Iran. And will seek to build on this moment with active, principled American leadership." He placed the region in the context of global collective security against efforts to undermine the rules-based order by Russia, China, and other countries with this intent. The U.S. cannot fix, but only ameliorate the dysfunctionalities which have long bedeviled the Middle East, notably the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But it can encourage homegrown developments by assisting on the margins while maintaining, with its collective security order, backed by free trade and access to investments and funding, a stable environment within which regional states and populations can develop. Now I'm going to turn to China. That wasn't actually on the agenda, but I have spent a lot of time in Asia and working on Asia. I was actually the American representative to what's called APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. I would say don't expect China to take over management of the Middle East either. China, like the US, has major interests, but there's no indication that it wants a dominant position, in part because China has many problems of its own, many of its own making, to address on the international and domestic front. I think China has missed an opportunity, and I think everybody's always going to be comfortable in dividing the world into US-China confrontations, but in fact, I think China's missed an opportunity. Instead of building on Xi Jinping's liberalizing reforms and integration with the global economy in partnership with the United States, the current leader, Xi Jinping, has chosen a different path. The results of his policies indicate that he is weakening, not strengthening China as a competitor to the United States. The longer he stays in power, the less competitive the country may become due to a number of factors. Xi has definitely transformed China, but he's moving away from being a partner with the United States to being a chief strategic adversary. He appears to be determined to capitalize on his country's recently acquired wealth to challenge America's economic primacy, technological advantage, military dominance, and assumptions about the global order that forms the foundation of America's power. As long as he remains in power, and it looks like he'll likely remain in power, this competition will continue. But the actual results of its policies indicate that he may be weakening, not strengthening China as a competitor. I'm an economist, basically, at heart. Under Xi's leadership, the economy has slowed. Missed growth targets, growth lowered from 7.8% in 2012 to 3.3% this year, according to the IMF. Now, that's due to a lot of reasons. But some of them are: China faces rising debt levels, increased dependence on imported energy. He has presided over high-profile government initiatives that have resulted in waste, mismanagement, and corruption. And also often overlooked are the demographics. They are not, frankly, in China's favor. Today, China has the world's largest population, with India following close behind. But by next century, China's population will be half of that due to demographic trends that cannot be reversed. Xi's aggressive foreign policy has alienated most of the world's major powers and terrified neighbors in the region. The worldwide American network of alliances, which was strained and was weakening, is stronger now than in years, due in part to his policies, as well as Russia's aggression. Xi has promoted his own vision of a Sino-centric alternative, one that is friendlier to authoritarian regimes. His approach has persuaded the world's democracies to tighten their ties to the United States and to one another in order to counter the Chinese threat. One example: in June, the leaders of Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand participated in a NATO summit. I think we're also seeing more activity with the Quad, which consists of US, Australia, India, and Japan. For a moment, though, let's look at blocs and regimes. We usually refer to nations that ally and are in competition with each other as blocs. Both are identifiable by geography, a function. I grew up when the world was dominated by US and Soviet blocs. There are currently two mega blocs mentioned before, United States and China. On the other hand, there are regimes, pulling from the French version of what the word means, referring to structures and exercises of power, as well as a system of norms, influences, obligations, and expectations, such as nuclear nonproliferation, trade, and investment. Regimes have been an important component of the international order. Regimes favor competition over cooperation over competition, and seek to transform geographical boundaries into peaceful economic and commercial entities. I'm thinking of the European Union. The United States and its allies and partners are running a hugely successful collective security-based global regime that underpins the rules-based international systems, including its financial, trade, and value systems. Regimes have served us well, but there's no doubt that many of the positive norms of international comedy are breaking down and being replaced by negative ones. There is hope. A number of the blocs, there are positive indications that agreements being made and blocs are being formed. And all blocs are not necessarily negative, and we're hopeful that blocs can be transformed into regimes. How to get there? Talks between rivals tend to fall in the transformational and the transactional. many of the agreements that we're seeing today seem to be focused on the transactional. I'm not against the transactional agreements. I think, in fact, they can lead to transformative ones. And what kind am I talking about? Now getting to the Middle East. The countries in the Gulf have a major role to play, not just in supplying crucial and critical energy supplies, but in supporting the rules-based world order that benefits them and their citizens. The U.S. and Europe need not just Western states, but also the Middle East states to replace boycotted oil and natural gas, to vote in the right way in the United Nations, and to implement sanctions. Regional powers need American and European backing in the face of threats in the neighborhood. I'm not going to go into some of the examples because I think the other examples of blocs that could be potentially transformed into regimes. You mentioned the one about the negotiations in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'm sure somebody's going to talk about the Abraham Accords. People would probably also like to talk about the JCPOA, although I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you very much. We'll go now to Sayyid Mohammed Merendi, known to many of you. He's both a political advisor and a long senior professor at the University of Tehran. We want the view from Iran, but we want the view on the region and not just on the JCPOA and on the world as well. And I think Sayyid Mohammed Merendi will hopefully share a perspective based on not just what he heard, but based on how he sees things.
I think it would be best for me, giving a view from Tehran, to basically start with the assumption that we have sort of moved towards a multipolar disorder, not very different from what Joseph was saying earlier. But I think the roots actually go back before the invasion of Iraq. I think it goes back probably to the Clinton years in particular, to a degree, the Reagan years, deregulation in the United States, the transformation of the United States from a country where businesses, let's say many, as an example, newspapers were locally owned, and gradually as a result you saw newspapers, banks, and major financial institutions all combine into what we now see today, where there are a handful of power centers of power. And the middle class has gradually not disappeared, but has been severely weakened. And then I think the wars, the perpetual wars since 2003, intensified this process. So I think to the economic crisis in 2008 and 2009 was triggered by the war, but I think it goes back to issues that are far deeper and have greater repercussions in themselves. But these wars served as a catalyst, in my opinion. So for Iran, since you asked my opinion on Iran, Iran has always felt from the beginning that after the revolution, the United States has not accepted its existence. And we can debate on what happened in the history, and I'll leave that for the questions and answers and the state of play for later. But what I would say is that Iran has reached a point where it feels that it is no longer worthwhile to wait and see what the United States and the Europeans are going to do. So it's sort of, I'm going back to the JCPOA, which was referenced a couple of times earlier. Not that the Iranians don't want to deal. The Iranians will continue to pursue a deal. I spent 3 months of my life in Vienna, stuck in a hotel basically during the negotiations. So obviously for the Iranians, it is significant. But they're no longer going to wait, because the Iranians don't feel that they can trust Americans or the Europeans to abide by commitments, because the Iranians feel that the Americans simply can't stick to their commitments because they can't accept Iran. So what has happened as a result? Iran is tilting towards, you could call it the global south, you can call it the east, but one specific manifestation of that change in Iranian foreign policy is the recent joining of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was a huge event. This particular meeting I'm alluding to, because of the fact that the global changes that are taking place have changed the dynamics both collectively but also bilaterally between different members of this organization. So many of the decisions made in Uzbekistan were on the sidelines between Iran and Russia, Russia-China, Iran-China, Iran-India, Russia and India, and so on, which I think will probably transform the region. And of course, Iran would like to see countries like Turkey to tilt more towards Asia and tilt away from Europe, as well as other countries that Iran feels would contribute to this changing order, but let's say an organized, let's say, tilt away from what we had before. Now, let us assume that there is a nuclear deal, and that I don't think that something, it would be unexpected. I think probably the United States is waiting for the elections. I'm guessing this. It's not something that I know for certain, but I think the belief in Tehran is that after Iran gave its response to a text put forward by the EU, and the EU looked upon the Iranian response favorably, the US afterwards, they delayed their response, and then the US response was the response was from the perspective of Tehran, a delaying tactic. And from then on, the Iranians began to feel that this has probably more to do with internal US dynamics and possibly the elections that will take place for the leadership for the premiership of the Israeli regime. Now, if there is a deal, my assumption is that the United States and the Europeans won't change their policy dramatically. I mean, the United States definitely not, and the Europeans, I doubt they will make significant moves. So I am not very optimistic for any major shift in European or NATO policy towards Iran. If there isn't a deal, again, I think that we're going to continue to see the current status quo. Again, so while I think Iranians want a deal, but you can sort of see how limited the excitement is, because European companies will probably refrain from coming to Iran, which, in my opinion, is to a large degree what has pushed Iran closer towards Russia, China, India, and non-Western countries. In other words, the Europeans and the United States in particular, they have to a large degree contributed to the current Iranian policy, especially since the previous administration tried very hard to improve ties with Western countries. I was a part of the same delegation that negotiated the JCPOA. I worked both under Dr. Bagheri as well as Dr. Zarif. I was in Vienna back then, and now the Iranians back then were very, I don't want to say optimistic, but they were more optimistic about the fate of the JCPOA and the fact that it was undermined literally immediately by Obama, and then of course later on completely ripped apart by Trump, I think created this skepticism that the new administration, which already had a different orientation, will use to justify its current policy of continuing to seek non-Western partners.
Thank you, Said Marindi. Last but not least, the view from Ankara. Turkey is an important regional player and has been part and parcel of everything we've seen in the last decade, both on the instability and conflict side, but also on the normalization and the de-escalation side.
Thank you, Tarek, and thank you, invitation again, and congratulations with your new institution and its first event. I was planning to talk a little bit about the global scene, but since you specifically asked that, not a view from Ankara, a view in Doha. Yes, true, it's called, in general, Turkish normalization with this and that country. I don't call it that way, because normalization, by definition, or at least what we know in international relations and the foreign policy, should come with set of strategic depth. It's not there. It's mostly the relations with cut off, with this reason and that reason for years, are being restored. So that's it, mostly. Will it produce its own value sets? Will its depth? We don't know. Do the actors have such a capacity? Very limited. Take relations with Saudi Arabia. It will be quite difficult to set the arena and talk about economic, social, political, geopolitical issues where both countries could find a space to talk each other and produce something solid. And it's understandable. It's understandable. But this is what Turkey knows very well for years. Turkish foreign policy was mainly Turkish foreign relations between 1952 to 2003, when Turkey actively rejected being part of US occupation of Iraq. There are other instances, for example, 1974 Cyprus intervention, I mean, not listening entire Western status quo on that issue, but 2003 was a civilian intervention disregarding establishment and army approach on the issue and producing a policy set, which is a sustained thing because it continued with EU membership approach, democratization approach, and during Arab Spring, same line preserved. So it was a policy. But up until that point, the Turkish foreign policy more or less reduced to foreign relations. It's understandable. It was the years of Cold War, and the security is provided within the NATO umbrella, and civilians were literally not having their chairs how to run the country. We are a little bit back to those approach. The relations are easily resettled. It's not a big deal, by the way. You just extend your hand, and if there is a hand other side, you shake your hands. But what's coming after that is a big question. So I wouldn't call having relations with Israel again as a normalization, because it lacks all kinds of policy issues. There is not a single agreement on what will happen to Palestine, Palestinians, etc., or the Gulf, or the Saudi Arabia. So these are resettling relations back, lacking normalization attempts. And this is understandable. Why it is understandable? It's not only Turkey, but the entire region is suffering from this vision thing, which we told yesterday in our closed meetings. And that vision is not going to be easily settled itself in coming years. Let me say what I am going to say at the very end. The title is Regional Order. What I am observing is, after 10 years of regional unsustainable disorder, we are moving from unsustainable regional disorder to sustainable regional disorder. This order will be there because there is no policy offer from any country whatsoever to change things in the region, and the lexicon radically changed. And you know this very well, Tariq, why? Probably you organized more than 100 meetings in this country or elsewhere, and your lexicon last 10 years were filled with change, democracy, people, uprisings, the future, etc. That lexicon is gone. There is just one word which settled itself back, which is irony to talk about regional sustainable disorder, is stability. Biden mentioned stability in Jeddah summit, and the Putin, Erdogan, and Raisi was talking about stability, so they agreed on it. So there is no huge diversion between parties about what will happen in coming near future. So what do they mean by stability? Is divorced from any political aspirations, any political democratic demands, securitization of entire issue with in a very status quo environment. And by the way, even if you wanted to have some changes, there aren't both no leverages and motivation. I'm finishing. 4 years, regardless of their success or regardless of their results, there were political movements, there were regional issues which people and the political parties cried on it. For example, in the new sustainable disorder, there is no Palestinian issue. It's almost closed chapter. People are not asking for democracy. We are not expecting radical changes within the countries, etc. Just one last point, maybe in QA session I want to go in detail, but these things are going to happen under one new pressure point, globally and regionally. When geopolitics meets globally with inflation, usually ugly things happen. If you check out the literature, you will see the inflation thing as price revolutions. And we all understand what could possibly happen when revolution happens. Last time when the global depression happened in 2008-9, we had Arab Springs because that depression created inflation, oil prices went down, etc. and etc. We had a turmoil. So the biggest problem to sustain this sustainable disorder under inflationary pressures will be high. Am I done within the limit?
Thank you, Taha. That
Okay,
was really good, like all the other contributions. We have 30 minutes to go. Normally, at the end of the interventions from the panelists, the moderator tries to summarize or provide some key takeaways. I'm not going to try to do that because I myself, as I said at the beginning, I'm struggling with these issues. And I think a lot of the contributions from the panelists reflects the uncertainty, the complexity of the problem, and the nature of the challenges moving forward. Instead, we'd like to use the 30 minutes effectively, and we want you to be a part of this discussion. So the next 30 minutes will be a question and answer session. Feel free to direct your question to any of the speakers specifically, or just put out a comment and a question. We'll collect them and we'll go back to the speakers. We'll start with this side of the room, and unless people don't raise their hands, I'm going to call on them by name. Saeed. You can't raise your hand and then take it back. So
Maybe they should stand.
He raised his hand.
Thank you very much, everybody. Personally, I tend to disagree with saying that we are going through some sort of a stability, and agree more on that we are actually heading towards more instability in the region because of all the economic problems and the still growing political differences in the region. What we see as Arabs and Muslims, and this is something we spoke about before, is that the Arab Sunni Muslim countries are falling down slowly, and the regional superpowers, each one of them setting themselves up to benefit from the ongoing collapse in the Arab Muslim world. Syria, Turkey reorganizing itself, Iran finding new positions, new strength in Shanghai, and I think I agree with the professor from Tehran, that I think they found new strength in their new relationship, and they are reading the regional, the power changes in the world better than us, as far as I'm concerned. And I think America's re-interest in the Middle East is just temporary one. This is just part of trying to stand up to the war in Ukraine and trying to support their European allies with energy. However, I think eventually America's politics will change. I was in the US myself, and I think there is a hidden dimension. I was just visiting in the US. And if you stay in the US for a month or two and you watch the news and you watch Fox News and you watch the rest of the news, you can feel there is a big crack, in the American society and American politics, and there is a lot of polarization inside the United States political scene, which I think in many ways we have not seen its reflection yet on the international scene. I think sooner or later, what is happening in America will reflect itself and will impact international relations, and probably will find more impact on the Middle East and other places. I think the United States is the key, understanding the changes in the US and the politics between the two parties, and the progressive powers, et cetera, are going to play a significant role in the face of the new global issues and dealing with them eventually. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Saeed. We'll come to the panelists for some responses. But it's a set of issues put on the table. We did not hear the phrase Arab Sunni states in a while, and yet it's back in the news a lot, and it's back in policy debates as well. Can we still talk about the Arab Sunni states, or are we talking about the region? So we'll come to you guys for some reactions. Zakaria, you raised your hand. I haven't seen you in 3 years. So I'm curious as to what you're going to ask. Please, there's a mic.
From 3 years, I consider 30 years, my dear friend.
Habibi, Allah yakhlik.
So first, I express my thanks to you, distinguished speakers, with their fruitful discussions and diversity of point of views. But I want to speak in a very important point. You are speaking now about resetting a regional order. The first step or requirement, stop please this draconic swap. I mean, exchanging arms, bombs, bomb gas, tools of torture which are sent to our totalitarian regimes against our money of poor, making your prosperity the big powers. We need from you, I mean big powers, we need technology, manures, food, we need morals, and then there will be no terrorism, no chaos at all, and we will live all in peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Zakaria. I interpret that to be, an emphasis on some of the domestic issues, which we did not talk about, but we'll come back to. Dr. Mazen?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for, an excellent panel, an excellent view of, how you see things going. I have a question. Post-World War II and the massive suffering that humanity has, the United Nations was born a lot more stress on rule-based and democracies and human rights. If, what's happening right now in Ukraine gets to a very, sad situation where we see a lot more suffering, is there a possibility that the Western world, the US, would more genuinely side with democracies and human rights around the world, or would they continue to support not so democratic regimes like, in my view, Israel and others because of their, just political interests? I mean, would we see the West truly, be more honest to the values of justice and democracy? Or do you think that's too far, reach to expect from those Western powers?
Thank you very much. We have Dr. Khaled, I believe. I may not have seen many of you for 3 years, but I still remember your names.
You are actually very good.
Dr. Khaled, تفضل.
Remember names. Okay, thank you very much for the speakers. My question and comment to our speaker from Ankara. You mentioned in the passing that in the coming sustainable regional disorder, the issue of Palestine almost kind of a closed chapter. This is very blunt and very frustrating, well, very honest. My question to you is how anchored this view is in Ankara itself. Is this very close to the official circles, you think, in your assessment, or is it kind of your personal assessment? And if this chapter is closed in the coming, God knows how many years, in this sustainable regional disorder, if this chapter is closed almost kind of intentionally and officially, then what would be the future? What is the rhetoric of the Turkish official line? And maybe this applies to the Iranian official line as well, because even when the chapter was opened, there was no progress whatsoever. So if there is an official declaration that this chapter is closed, so what is then the next phase? Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, we'll take a question from this side of the room. The lady.
Good evening. Good evening, and thank you so much for this insightful session. I have two questions. My question one is, like, recently Shanghai Cooperation Organization has held a summit in Samarkand where Iran was accepted as a full member, and Saudi Arabia and Qatar has been accepted as a dialogue partner. So do you think it means the Middle Eastern states or the Gulf region is more inclined toward China and Russia? And my second question is, as we see, a new regional order in making as the title of the session today, if there is a new regional order in making, then who is going to lead this region? There will be a tough competition, or it's going to be more instability, or how you see it? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come back to the panelists. We'll go with the same order. Joe?
Yes, thank you, Tariq. In fact, I'll probably take the question of the gentleman here. Two questions, in fact. I fully agree with you that, and we discussed this in our closed meeting. In fact, the international system today, one of its dysfunctioning features is the fact that the regulatory body is out of order. I think, with all due gratitude, let's say, for the UN system to have worked probably during the Cold War and a little bit after, it's already today, I think it's completely today inadapted to the world as it is. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that you have to completely take it off and put something else, because it's impossible. But I think that a serious reform of at least the Security Council is today to be considered. This is, I'm not saying something new. A lot of people have given a thought on that, a lot of high-level diplomats, foreign ministers, etc. The problem is that it's very difficult to do, as we say in Arabic sometimes, al-barid, without a world crisis. I mean, both the League of Nations and the UN were born after a human catastrophe that were World War I and World War II. So how to transform the UN system today and the Security Council more precisely, and the veto system, because this is exactly the issue, and enlarge it to represent let's say, a more adapted image of the world system. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, India, etc., who are not today in the Security Council, is something that is very strange. Or the EU, in a way or another, that would replace maybe France and Great Britain. But you can imagine what fuss would it take to go this way. But I think that this is a question that has to be put on the world agenda. It's something that is becoming very, very pressing. The second thing that also I completely agree with you, and here, I mean, I alluded to it when I said that one of the features of instability, of sources of instability in this region, is the fact that the Arab revolutions are still unaddressed. If I have to address one, let's say, grief or reproach to at least to the West, okay, or to Europe, and maybe less to the US, because I don't think that, I mean, let's keep it there, to Europe. I would say that anyone who has gone through the literature of the EU for decades on democracy, rule of law, civil society, etc., can see and very quickly notice how, I would say, hypocritical this discourse was when they were faced with the Arab revolutions. They very quickly retrenched to a sort of all-security approach, tetanized and terrorized by the flow of refugees, very quickly depicting everything that was happening there in terms of Islamists, etc., forgetting that democracy, change, inclusion, pluralism is something that takes a very long time. And I think that today, probably, one of the main issues that this region of the world has with the West is probably a conceptual issue more than a political only issue. We need to redefine maybe certain concepts. They need to redefine what they understand by democracy, change, gradual openness, etc. And probably they would need to look at this region with lenses that are much more adapted to the region and not only to themselves and the way they see themselves. I'm sorry, I'm a bit blunt, but I think that this is a main, I think, reflection on a decade or more of very, very let's say, unhealthy relation between this part of the world and the West. And when you talk about, I mean, an order based on justice, freedom, and etc., I think that we have missed a very important opportunity and very important occasion to redefine these concepts on the world scene.
Thank you, Joe. Pat.
Well, I would just say, with regard to Joe's comments on the United Nations, especially with regard to the Security Council and the veto system, it's long overdue a reform. I just hope it doesn't take a major catastrophe to cause that to happen. So hopefully not. And the young lady asked about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think what I was trying to say when I was talking about blocs and regimes, that in fact, it's not necessarily an either or, that just because the Gulf countries are engaging with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that's actually good, because it's my understanding that a lot of the discussions there have been about becoming a more general economic unit with common standards and trade policies and broadening the dialogue even with other groups such as ASEAN. So I don't think that that's necessarily negative. I think that countries coming together, even if it is just over one transactional issue, is better than not coming together over on that issue. And the hope is that they can be transformed. The European Union started as a coal and steel agreement in the 1950s. It evolved to the economic, and it's now encompasses political as well, and currency and other things. These things can evolve, and generally, it's a positive thing. So I don't see it as an either or.
Thank you. Sayyid Muhammad.
I'm growing old and forgetful, so I wanted to take out my cell phone and type the questions, but I thought everyone would be saying I'm chatting with my cousins or something back in Tehran, so I don't remember the questions very well. I'll touch upon two questions and hopefully it'll suffice. Personally, I think, and this is again a view from Tehran, this is my view, I think that the influence of foreign powers in this region have not been constructive. And I understand why countries in this region would feel, or certain countries in this region would feel the need for their presence. But personally, I feel that their presence has been more destructive than fruitful. The more attention paid to Ukraine or to China, of course for very terrible reasons, but the less focus on this region by those powers, I think actually creates an opportunity for countries in the region to start rethinking their relationships and to start seeking solutions. So real dialogue can take place, or more constructive dialogue can take place. Of course, this may not happen. I'm not saying that this is inevitable, but I think that this is a possibility. So while we've seen a lot of destructive wars and conflicts across the region for a very long time, there is an opportunity. If we are too pessimistic about the future, then I think we automatically push ourselves in that direction. The second point about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is, in my opinion, it's a reflective of a changing reality. And while I think that it's a very important platform, not only because of the collective agreements, but also the very fact that, as pointed out earlier by Patricia, the very fact that these leaders in general sit together and have meetings and then have meetings on the sidelines enable these countries to work better with each other as Asia rises. Of course, Asia is on the rise as we speak, but there's also this variable, and as we see in Ukraine, that we're currently seeing manifest itself in Ukraine. Because I think that there is a possibility that, or a strong possibility, that as the war in Ukraine intensifies, as the crisis continues to increase in proportions, then I think that we're probably heading towards, and I'm not an economist, so you can negate everything that I say, but I think that we're heading for a very major economic downturn that's much more than a recession. Mm-hmm. And if that is the case, then I think that we have to rethink many things.
Thank you. Taha?
Yeah, I got one question and one half question. No, I'm not talking as an official. I just said at the very beginning, not for Ankara. I'm talking in Doha. But if you're asking Ankara's official line, what they say is what they believe, and I also believe what they say is true, their true intentions. Both President and the Foreign Minister reiterated this several times, that having a relationship with Israel has nothing to do with our view and relations with Palestinian issue and Palestinians. A new thing in Turkish foreign policy, which was not there, started by 2006 and now on. Turkey directly had relationship with Palestinian organizations. So it was never case in Turkish foreign policy up until 2006. And since then, that relationship continues. I don't see any problem on that. It will probably continue. But what I am trying to say was, as a regional issue, Palestinian issue is more or less closed chapter, and Israel enjoys this very much. by literally turning Palestinian issue as a municipality issue. And the region in general, which I described, could be depicted with one word: fatigue. After all years of exhaustion, weary, jaded, civil wars, occupations, etc., literally, the region is in political fatigue. And after missing the big chance of Arab revolutions to bring at least some modest change, such as having some elections, if not a fully functioning democracy, the hopes are gone and motivation is heavily down. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not a very black and white, closed and open chapter of Palestine. So what I was trying to depict for the region for coming years, we are unfortunately going to live in this fatigue environment. And under this unmotivated environment, the other pressure will be, and it should be taken very seriously, the global political economic issues will press too much on that. When that happens, there might be a hope, which Joseph mentioned a little bit, because at the same time, a huge negative energy accumulated within the people. And that I don't know, but we know from the literature there is always change by accidents. Would it trigger something? We don't know. It did 10 years ago, maybe again, I don't know. But what I'm saying is the atmosphere will be very tense, and this much securitization didn't produce anything, by the way. All kinds of ethnic policies reached its limits. There aren't more Arabs to reach, more Turks to reach. Sectarian politics reached its limits. There aren't more Shiites to find and reach him, to convince him. Same thing goes with Sunnis. All kinds of motivations are down right now. So maybe a reset may come up out of it. Usually in economy, Tariq knows, it happens. When Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1985, we had a Plaza consensus. Now, global system must find another consensus economically, because that low inflation, low interest rates, and the growth years are gone, a new era is opening up, and it needs a new consensus. Let me finish with this positive note. Why not, for this region, a new consensus emerge, at least within the people?
Thank you, Taha. Sayyid Muhammad?
Yes, just one sentence that I wanted to add, and that is that, again, in my personal opinion, again, war in Europe is nothing to be happy about. It's tragic for everyone involved. But I think that when it comes to our region, again, I have to phrase it in a way to not make war look positive, but one positive note, and you may disagree with me, is that the Israeli regime, its power, its sustainability, to a large degree comes from support from Western countries. And Western countries, because of this long decline that, again, Joseph alluded to and I gave my opinions on, but also because of the current war in Ukraine, I think it's going to be more difficult for Western countries in future to give the sort of support to the Israeli regime that they did in the past. And that, I think, is going to make it more difficult for the future of this entity to sustain itself, at least in the way in which it has been doing so in the past.
Thank you. We have time for 3 questions. We're going to take them very quickly. My dear friend from Japan, in the second row. Get the mic.
Is that him?
Thank you very much for insightful discussions. My name is Kazuto. I'm a Japanese graduate student in the Gulf Studies Center in Qatar University. I have a question to Ambassador Haslak. on the rivalry between the US and China in the Middle East. When this topic is discussed, diplomatic and scholarly narratives are often on the competition, if not confrontation, between the two superpowers. And my question is, in the context of the making of the new regional order in the Middle East, can the US and China not be rivalry partners? In other words, despite being rivals, can there not be any room for cooperation for selected matters, if not all matters? If there can be room for cooperation, in what domains?
Thank you.
I think there's definitely room for competition, and I think everyone needs to remember the United States and China still have full diplomatic relations and cooperate in a number of areas. And one of the areas I mentioned that I worked on was on APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. I don't know if people are aware, but that actual grouping of countries actually includes Taiwan and Hong Kong and China. So in fact, it's a pretty amazing group, and Japan is also a member of that. I think, you know, the U.S. And China are in competition, I think, you know, in economic reasons, but the U.S. and Britain are in competition in the over business and investment and all of these things. It's not just that the U.S. and China are competing with each other, but there's competition and there's also cooperation. And I do think in this particular area, at least unless somebody corrects me, I do not see that China has any desire to be managing the Middle East, unless somebody disagrees with that. So I think there's room. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ghanem, can we please bring the mic here?
Good evening. We've heard this expression a lot, that Americans are withdrawing from the region. We are debating here in Doha among us. Is this good or bad? I think we need...
I think, are you addressing me? Obviously.
To everybody. To everybody. What we have seen in American management of this region, we've seen authoritarian regimes. We've seen iron fist control over the population. We've seen poverty for most. We've seen chaos. Even we've seen the blockade on Qatar, had the green light from President Trump. Is this good or bad? This is my question. To have an everyday management, or just to leave us alone a little bit. Give us some time to see what we can do. This is, of course, for the whole panel.
Thank you. We'll go to Noha very briefly also, and then we'll come back to the panelists and close in 3 minutes. Noha? Or Dr. Noha?
Can you hear me? Oh. Thanks, Tariq, and thanks for the interesting discussion. I wanted to pick up on what Joseph and Patricia said about the UN Security Council reform. And you noted, of course, how difficult that is. Any sort of reform to the UN Security Council would require an amendment to the UN Charter, which would require no vetoes from the Security Council members. But I wonder what you think about the General Assembly and its role, and whether there's room for it to have an amplified role, especially given the latest initiative by Liechtenstein, the veto initiative that requires the UN Security Council members who use their veto to explain why they use their veto and engage in that sort of debate with the General Assembly as a sort of form of accountability. But also the fact that the General Assembly, it was through the General Assembly that Palestine was recognized as a de facto state, which then allowed Palestine to ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which is now investigating crimes on the Palestinian territories. And also, there are many other examples of accomplishments by the General Assembly. So I just wonder what you think of that. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go again to the same order. Joe, you have a very specific question, so if you can respond to it.
I'll disappoint you by leaving my neighbor on the right answering this question, because apparently it's very specialized. I'm not at all an international lawyer, but I can see exactly what you say. Probably there's something there, but I'll leave the details for you. Maybe I'll react on one thing. to my two colleagues, very interesting, let's say, formulations, multipolar disorder by Hamad Marandi and sustainable regional disorder by Taha. In fact, I think since we are on for a long period of, let's say, fluctuation, instability, etc., you know, there is a kind of, as we say in French, tarte à la crème of looking for a regional security architecture. We won't find it, probably. But what we need to find, probably in the interim, is a way to organize the chaos, or to organize the disorder, meaning managing the crisis and not solving it. And this is probably what's lacking in the region, a kind of formula, of forum and formula that resembles the transactional behavior of certain states that would be transactional in nature in order at least to find a kind of, let's say, modus vivendi and modus operandi during the time of disorder. A very quick word on your reflection, sir, on the US. I tend to agree, maybe without going as far as you did, but I would say that for certain regions of the world, when the US retrenchment started, it was a kind of blessing. For Europe, for example, the whole reflection on the strategic autonomy that was launched by President Macron and then by the German Chancellor was an occasion to say, okay, now we have to live alone. I mean, we don't have a big brother anymore. We have to learn and to live alone. However, unfortunately, maybe the Ukraine war came and put a halt to that. Now, in the region here, I agree with you that, and we discussed that also, many countries are saying, okay, now it's time to take our issues in our own hands. It will take time. The problem is that they are not taking this collectively. They are taking that everyone by itself, and this will probably add disorder to the disorder. But of course, it's an open question.
Thank you. Patricia, you've got a minute.
Okay, real quickly, last time I checked, the United States did not abandon Qatar. I cannot defend anything that Donald Trump says, but in fact, the United States stayed committed to Qatar during the blockade. We kept, you know, full operations as far as I know, and as far as I know, pretty close relationships in the defense as well as in the economic sphere. So, but I do also agree that maybe, you know, not having so much a big brother in town maybe is a good thing. Doing a little bit with your regional partners here may be an approach that should be considered. With regard to the United Nations, I am also not an expert on it, but I do think that there are different ways to look at reform, and one way might be through the General Assembly. If you cannot get any reforms through the Security Council. However, I don't know if any of you were listening to Putin's remarks the other day when he was talking about fighting the global international order and the norms and the values and the system that's been built since World War II. I would say we should have a vacancy on the Security Council, because if one of the members doesn't support, in fact, the whole reason for the setup of the United Nations, then perhaps that should be considered.
Thank you. Said Marindi, 1 minute.
Wasn't directed to me, but I think that if Russia is removed from the UN Security Council, then everyone else also has to be removed from the UN Security Council.
Well, maybe, yeah.
I don't share the optimism that, I don't know if we were optimistic or not. I don't share the optimism of reform at the UN, because I don't feel that the countries who control the UN are willing to give up that sort of control. But I do think that the UN is becoming increasingly irrelevant. Whether it's a good thing or not, that's open to debate. But when you look at and I think that one reason why we have BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other such bodies on the rise is because many of these countries are feeling that the current order is not sustainable, and that the current bodies are not answerable to the needs that exist today.
Thank you. Last but not least, Taha.
I'm not going to add much, so we can just, I don't want to get into this UN debate.
Okay, okay. Well, we finished right on time. Thanks. I mean, we'll come to everybody. First, I need to thank everyone in the hall who's responded and attended tonight's presentation, and for many people who've posed questions. It's going to take a while before we get this right. It's been 3 years since we've actually engaged publicly, and inshallah, the next iteration of this will be much more engaged with the audience in soliciting your opinion, getting you to intervene, and make commentary. But this would not have been possible without the presence and the participation of the 4 distinguished speakers. So for that, I'd like you to join me in expressing our thanks to them for being with us tonight. And we will see you after the World Cup, inshallah. Meanwhile, please join us for a reception afterwards.